Hey everybody, so thanks for joining again. So as you guys know, this is our second day of our dev training. I know it looks like somebody joined our day one meeting. I'll adjust the video so it says day two. But essentially for our first day, if you recall, we went over our Acumen, our product. We went over our documentation, where you can get information about our product, where you can get developer information. And so today we're really going to get started and jumping into actually deploying code. So all the things that Brad and I talked about yesterday, we're going to start focusing on. The last day for tomorrow is going to be focused on widgets. But if we go to what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be going through the tool chain, the site definition. As you know, Brad and I were alluding to yesterday, we're going to review the lists and content types from a developer perspective. Also, we're going to go over the master page, our CSS, and some term stores. We may take a quick break for you guys to take a restroom. And then after that, we're going to go talk about populating libraries and discuss and go through building like a basic virtual page and just review some various site artifacts and eventing and callbacks that you can use. So some of you may have noticed in my main meeting invite, I have adjusted the times to what, I think will take for our team, just to set expectations for you guys. We typically reserve, 4 hours for each session. Sometimes they take more time, sometimes they take less. Typically with a small group like this, we can get it done in a lot faster. So if we need more time, we'll take more time, but that's about what we expect. So hopefully that will help you adjust your calendar as well for the week.
Sounds good.
All right. So I know Brad is going to start now, so I'll let him present and we can keep going.
All right. Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, as Tyler mentioned yesterday, we covered a lot of topics from a high level. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into those topics, and we'll actually have some exercises to complete. There's some things that we're going to talk about today that you can try on your own within your own dev site, but we'll be walking through the concepts here. So some things are exercises today, some things are more conceptual, simply because we're all using a shared environment here. And if we were all to do these as exercises, we'd be writing over each other. So as we go through, we're going to go through the concept of creating and deploying different elements, and then you can try those on your own within your own dev environment. So yesterday we set up a project, and during training prep, you all set up your own projects, I should say. And those projects contain a variety of files and folders just out of box. There's a folder called Build. The Build folder contains what's called your site definitions. You can actually have more than one site definition in a site project. That site definition contains a lot of different things that we're going to look at today. Typically, a project will contain one site definition. I have, in many cases, had projects where we have two site definitions, one for the main site and then one for, say, department sites. That's not uncommon. And we'll talk about how you can leverage multiple site definitions in a project. We have a few other folders here, node modules, tools. These two folders are created by the Acumen generator and the Yeoman architecture. These two tools or folders right here contain all of the required code that's necessary for the site deployer and other capabilities within your project to function. We're going to talk about the source folder. The source folder contains all of your widget source. So when you build widgets, that's going to go in here, right, in this widgets folder. When we get to the widgets tomorrow, we're going to see that. You'll also have a set of files down here. These are all created again by the Yeoman tooling and the Acumen generator. But 3 of these files are critical for the function of your project. The first file, your .env file, this contains all of your environment variables, including your Azure storage information, the URLs of the site you're deploying to, as well as the central site. user IDs, passwords, and so on. Now, you'll notice for training, we have a user ID and a password here, or excuse me, right here and here. Typically, during development, we recommend using a client ID and client secret, or if you choose to use a user ID and password, you'll probably have MFA enabled on your site, which means you'll have to create an application password here. So a couple of different tricks there for logging into your site. A couple other things that are necessary. Okay, so SPURL and central SPURL. What's the difference? Well, this is your central site right here. And that is your delivery site. What's the difference? I'm going to pull up a different project here so you can see this. When creating, this is a good one. Yeah, when creating a project, you need to decide how you want to deploy different elements. Do you want to deploy them to your central site or your delivery site? And you'll see here SPURL, central SPURL on this other project. Just like this one, here we're going to be deploying to our delivery site. If instead you want to deploy to your central site, you can actually move the URL for your central site into this SPURL value and then have nothing in central. So for standard deployment to a delivery site, you'll have the configuration like this. But if you want to deploy to a central site instead, just repeating myself here. I'll learn how to use a mouse one day. You'll do it like that, and then you'll get rid of that. That's how you deploy to a central site. So it's a little weird because here it says central site, but that's only when you're deploying to a development site. Like that. All right, so again, user ID and password, use an application password here, or use a client ID and client secret instead of a user ID and password. This is safer because your client ID and client secret are tied to your machine, which means if somebody were able to steal this .env file from you, they wouldn't be able to get in unless they actually had your laptop. Now, a few other folders here that are important. SP directory. This is the folder where all of your assets are going to go. It's either a folder within SharePoint, within a folder or within a library called a Kumina library, or if you're working in headless like we will be, this SP directory is actually just a folder in your Azure storage underneath a folder called a Kumina library. So here for this site, these training sites, we have a folder, actually a blob called headless within that Kumina library and digital workplace right here. If we didn't want that to be digital workplace, we could change it here. Although generally I don't recommend that. I don't believe I've ever done that, so I cannot guarantee what will happen. Asset directory is the name of your site definition folder. So if you set up your project and you decided you wanted to change your site definition name or add another site definition, changing asset directory controls where your files are going to come from. That's why if you do a project with multiple site definitions, it works just fine because all you have to do is change this asset directory folder to control what you're going to deploy. env-dir, that's just the path to your site definitions folder. So you can see here, I'm in C Kumina training site project build. A couple of things. When setting up projects, Node.js doesn't do very well with really long paths. So try to keep your folders short. It also doesn't play well with folders that have spaces in the names, because then you have to go in places like this and escape those spaces out. So it gets a little tricky to get your variables right, and especially in your Webpack config. So I generally recommend, when creating projects, that you use folder names that are short and not include spaces in your folder names. Some folders you might want to avoid due to security restrictions. You might want to avoid using that projects folder underneath your user folder within Windows, because sometimes Windows UAC will block any executions in your will be in your documents folder. So you want to kind of avoid that. You can version, although this is typically used when deploying using Azure DevOps. So we usually leave that blank. If your site is multilingual and you'll be using multilingual capabilities on your site, you do need to set this to true and set the language ID to the default language. And Tyler, are these sites set up multilingual?
No, the
They're
client
not.
is also not using multilingual, so
Okay.
that's why.
Yeah, so we'll take that out entirely, and you can leave that blank. Again, client ID and client secret are preferred over user and password. Just Google SharePoint client ID, client secret. It'll get you to the page where you can generate that. If you're deploying for headless like we are, you will need your Azure storage information. These last two variables are kind of interesting. You can also have a CDN prefix if you're using CDNs for deployment. And if you're deploying to multiple sites, you can use the multi-deployment value here. Set this to true, and instead of using these values, there's actually a file you'll put in your site definition that lists all of the sites you want to deploy to. So let's say you create a new department site or change to a department site, and you want to deploy that out to all your departments. You can set multi-deployment to true and add in the appropriate file in here, and it will simply, one after another, execute deployment to all your sites. So it's kind of a cool extra feature there. The Learning Center has more information on how to use multi-deployment. We'll actually look at that right now. In the Learning Center, in that developer documentation that we shared yesterday, you'll find the site deployer information. In here are all of the variables that matter in your .env file, and you'll notice right here, multi-deployment. The site you need to, or the folder you need to create, a file you need to create is called inventory.sites.json, and here we go. Yeah, SPA updates and deploying to multiple sites. This is what that file looks like. And it goes in your site definitions under a folder called multi-deployment. And then that will deploy everything out. So this gives you a little bit more info on that. Now, the .env file sets up all your environment variables. Once you set that, you're pretty much done. And this file is going to be unique to you. If not for any reason but this, that path won't necessarily be the same as anybody else. Your user ID might be different. So we do not recommend storing your .env file in source control, because yours might be different than others. Get yours set up and configured, and you're good to go. Let's say you want to join a new project. Set up a nice empty site project like this, and then use source control to pull down the files that are shared. Shared files are all of the files within your site definition, except for the widget packages folder. This folder is a temporary folder. You don't want to store that you don't want to store any files from that folder in source control, but every other file and folder that is part of your site definition goes in source control. All of your widget source, so this SRC folder, this goes in source control, or actually technically source.js widgets goes in source control. Nothing else needs to go in source control. So your source.js widgets folder and any site definition folders you have, except for the widget packages folder in them. Go in source control. So I could create a nice empty project, get my .env file set up, get my other files configured the way I want them, and just simply pull down everything that goes in the widgets folder and everything that goes into my site folder, or whatever site definition you have, and you're good to go. Now, when you created your project, the Acumatica generator created this folder for you because you told it to do that. So whatever client name you gave it, that's this site definition folder name. It's also in your Webpack config file. The Webpack config file is the file used to determine how to pack your JavaScript for your widgets. It is required. It's part of a process called package. When you execute the package project, the Webpack config file is going to go through all your widget source and convert your JavaScript to a Webpacked version that is properly namespaced for your environment. The definition of that namespace is also created when you create your project, and the client name is added here. When building widgets, you can decide what you want the namespace for your widgets to be. And as long as that namespace matches the value here on line 8 and the value here on line 20, your widget will pack and deploy properly. If you want your site definition to differ from your widget namespace, and I often do, just change the value here and the value here, and you will have a new namespace for your widgets. I generally leave widgets, but I'll usually make this first value my project name, or if I'm working with a client, it'll be the client name, so that everything is unique. We'll see when we build widgets why that's valuable. But those two values are the only values you'll ever need to change in here. Used to be for headless deployment, we had to do some extra work in here. Don't have to do that anymore as of the latest tooling. I don't know if you even know that, Tyler. It just changed this week. So that's one of those changes that's a good change. We used to have to explicitly say what we wanted to deploy into a headless site. Don't have to do that anymore. Now, the third file that matters to you is the acumatica.sitedeployer.config.json file. This particular file will be referred to through the rest of training as your site deployer file or your site deployer config file. It contains a list of arguments that's going to use those values from your .env file and a list of options. We also call these steps. We have a variety of steps that are just inserted in here out of box. So when you first create your project, these steps are put in here. You'll notice one of them is set to true. You use these steps to define what gets deployed when you execute a deploy request. When you execute a deploy request, it's going to look at each of these steps. And if any is set to true, like widgets, it will execute that deploy operation. You can set multiple steps to true, and they will run in sequence. Setting a step to false is equivalent to not having it in here at all. Some steps are necessary for older versions of projects, like master page. This step is no longer used in the modern architecture. If you use classic architecture, the master page step is valuable. How do you know which is which? If we go back out to the Learning Center and we go to that same page we were at before, I can put this in the chat actually. There we go. And we scroll down here a little bit, we'll notice here all of these steps. This table here shows you what each step does and what it's for. And if we scroll down a little bit, you can even find out whether they're useful in classic or in modern, or both classic and modern. You can see here, master page is used to deploy a classic master page. Content files is actually used to deploy, actually content files or CDN files. I don't even think they've added CDN. Yeah, here we go. So content files or CDN assets are used to deploy your files from your project into the system. What's the difference? If you're not using headless, content files will deploy all of your files out to your SharePoint libraries. If you're using headless, CDN assets will deploy all of your files out to your headless environment. We have several steps to deploy files into your SharePoint environment, but one step for headless. Other steps that work for your SharePoint environment: JS, CSS, and image files, as well as content files. These allow you to deploy different subfolders of your files out to SharePoint, while the CDN asset simply deploys everything. It's a cleaner way to do it. You don't really need to divide up your steps. All right, so what's all this mean? All right, we have this project, we have our steps that define what to deploy, but our project is empty. If I were to try to deploy anything right now, nothing would happen because I don't have a site definition yet. And we're going to try something here. Let's see if this works. I am going to see if I can put a zip file in the chat. Does not look like I can. All right, I'm going to mail this to everybody. Let's see if everybody can get it this way. So I have a demo site definition that I'm going to send everybody. And this example site definition for the training is really a great place to start. And let me know if you get that. If not, we'll find another way to get it to you. I can also share a cloud drive if we need to.
I think our email strips zips, but we'll see in a moment.
Brad, give it to me and I'll add it to our OneDrive that I've shared already with the Wayne Blair team.
Oh, that'll work. So Tyler, I just I copied you on the email, so you should get it here in a moment.
I'll send that out to everybody. Give me 1 second, guys.
Did you send the OneDrive? I think I missed that.
Let me resend.
All right.
And so once you get that, let me know. You'll want to unzip that, and then we're going to actually add a bunch of files into our sample site definition here, our empty site definition.
Yeah, the email you sent, it did get stripped.
Okay.
I sent in the chat, guys. Can you see if you let me know if you have access to that OneDrive? And there you'll see the recording, our training deck, and you'll see the My Site 2 zip.
Yep.
And then just download that.
I was able to download the zip and unzip it. Commander?
Yeah, I downloaded
All good?
it.
Okay, cool.
I'll give you a moment to unzip that.
Yeah, all good.
All right, great. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those files and folders that are in there, and we're going to put them inside this My Site folder right here. In Visual Studio Code, you can just right-click on the folder and click Reveal in File Explorer. Usually it's a little bit easier. So there it is. So you can see in my path, it takes me down to this folder called My Site. It's empty except for that widget packages folder. The zip file I shared has a number of files and folders in it. There we go. All these you'll want to just copy and paste into your project right there. So along with that widget packages folder inside my site. And once you do, you should see them now in here.
I think
Yeah, I can see that.
we're supposed to copy it into my site, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't
So
looking at the
underneath the
screen,
my site
sorry.
folder.
Okay, got it.
Okay. Yeah, you don't want to have my site, then my site. You just want to have the folders that are in there. Now, our videos talk about creating your project called My Site. You can call this anything you want. Just remember that once you name it here, if you change that folder name or add new folders, you'll want to update your .env file. And if you don't want to use the same namespace for your widgets, you want to update your Webpack config file. All right, so let's go through what this site definition folder looks like. In a site definition, you'll have a number of different folders. One of those folders you'll see here is CDN assets. If I open this up, I have 3 folders: content, CSS, and JS. You can also have an images folder, and I believe IMG is also a valid folder. I mean, technically, you can have any folders you want in here. They would get deployed using that CDN assets step. If you were not working with headless, but instead you wanted to deploy out to SharePoint, instead of a folder called CDN assets here, you'll want to call it branding. And then for branding, the JS step will deploy that folder. The CSS step will deploy that folder. Content files will deploy that folder. And image files will deploy in images or IMG folder to SharePoint. Again, you'd have to call this folder branding for that to work. Technically, you can have files in the branding folder and files in CDN assets if you wanted to deploy files to SharePoint as well as your headless web application. I don't know when you would ever do that, but you can. So the different steps do the different operations. All right, so we're going to explore a few of these folders in a bit, but I just want to walk through the rest of them. Everything under CDN assets gets deployed to your headless environment. Everything else we see here gets deployed into your SharePoint environment and in different ways. Content types and list definitions. These will, anything in content types, when you execute the lists or update lists step, anything in content types will provision a content type in your SharePoint environment. Now, if you want it provisioned in your central environment, then you want to make sure that you're deploying, actually either way, no matter what. So with the .env file here, whether I'm deploying other assets to central or not, or to my delivery site, no matter what, the content type gets defined at the central site level. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out, is that's always defined centrally. Your lists, however, using the lists.xml folder or file or one called update.xml, they're going to go either to your delivery site if you're configured like this, or to your central site if you configure it to deploy everything to central. So content types are always defined across your sites from the central site. Lists that use those content types go either to central or to your delivery site, depending on your configuration here. And we're going to get into those here in a minute. Taxonomies, these are always defined centrally. This terms.xml file, that controls your term store, and we'll look at that in detail here in a little bit as well. If you want to upload files into a SharePoint library, we have the upload files option. In here, you need a folder with the same name as your library. The library does have to exist. and then any files or folders that you want to deploy into that library. So upload files contains folders that match the names of your libraries and the files that go in them. We'll see more about that. I mentioned the idea of virtual pages and virtual page layouts yesterday. Oh, by the way, sorry, anything in upload files is going to get deployed either central or delivery, depending on your configuration. Virtual pages and virtual page layouts are always deployed centrally. So when you create a virtual page or a virtual page layout, the central site will take that and configure it. All right, so let's walk through what some of these site definition elements are. Go back to lists and content types. When defining a content type, in your project, you're going to use a Microsoft standard format. You can actually Google Microsoft SharePoint list XML format. But the format is a node called lists. There's that one root node. Within that, you can have one or more content type nodes. Each content type has a name. You can give it a group name. Generally, you want to make sure those groups already exist. If not, it'll provision the group for you. Give your content type a good description so people understand what it means. If you want to inherit from an existing content type, you can by setting inherits equals true and parent equals the name of the content type you want to inherit. If you inherit a content type, you get all of its fields and properties, and you can then extend it. A couple of things happen here. You'll notice I don't have parent. As long as I don't have parent, this inherits equals true doesn't matter, so I just have it there. I can also set a version number on my content type. If I inherit a content type and I extend that content type and I use the same name, I will add fields to my existing content type. You cannot remove fields from an existing content type, and you cannot alter fields in an existing content type. Once that field has been provisioned, it is evergreen. So keep that in mind. As you're building out your project, you may need to go out into SharePoint and delete the content type as you're trying to, as you're developing it and trying to figure it out. Because once you set a field, you set that field. It's there. Once you provision a content type, it's there. So the only way to remove it is to go out to SharePoint. Don't forget, SharePoint has a recycle bin. It also has a second recycle bin. Anytime you delete a content type, you have to remove that from both. Of course, be very careful removing content types. If you provision a list in your project, and in that list provisioning, you set a content type here, that content type must be identified in this file. So what do you do if you want to use an existing content type? Well, that's easy. You set inherits equals true, you set parent to the existing content type name, and you use the same name. You don't do anything with your field ref zone. You just leave it alone. That way the deployer understands this content type is valid. Now, a lot of times I will start with one of the 26 or so Acumatica provided content types and then create new content types from those. So we have one, for example, called important dates. So it's got date information. It's great for events. Anytime I want to create a new content type that has date information like that, especially if it's around events, I'll always inherit important dates. I can also inherit multiple content types by setting the parent value equal to all of the content types I want to inherit with commas between them. So I can use this process to aggregate multiple content types into a new one. Or I can create a completely new content type like this. You'll see in here, again, it's got the name, group description, and so on. By the way, again, this being a Microsoft standard, if you Google this, the schema for it has lots of other properties you can put out here, including unique IDs and things like that. Inside your content type, you have a node called field refs. This is your reference for all of the fields that you're going to define on your content type. Here are a number of examples. We go back out to the Learning Center, and we go down here to list attribute deployments. You can learn a lot more about how all these files work and what different field types are and how you might configure them with some good examples here. Here's a numeric field. Here's a lookup field. Lookups are really powerful. It allows you to create a list that references other lists or the same list even. So you can have referential items. This is great for navigation. In fact, I think that's what this is. Yep, this is our navigation list. When you think about lists in SharePoint, you want to think about them the same way you would a table in a database, because that's basically what they are. And because they can reference each other, you can create a relational database using SharePoint lists. It's not as fast as SQL, but it gives you the ability to create data structures and data-driven functionality by defining that data in list form. As you can see here, we got a lot of nice information about that. If I don't want to define a new content type for a list, I can do this. I'm just going to copy this here so you can see this. Instead of defining a content type, I can take, or referencing a content type here, I can simply take that out and above my data node, put my fields. So I could define a new list either using a content type or explicitly defining its fields right here. So within the list node, I have a list that I'm going to define, and there is the structure, or I use a content type, either way. Now, both the lists file and the update list file allow you to provision a list. So this sample list here doesn't have to exist yet, and populate that list. Why would we have two files for that? Well, let's look back at our steps. You'll notice in the example here, it's got the lists step here. That's going to deploy, or that's going to execute the deployment of the list.xml file, and then the update list down here, but other things in between. Generally, best practice is to provision your list in lists.xml, but populate that list in update.xml. Gives you the ability to provision the list, do other things, and then fill the list in. Maybe you need to get some images in there first, because you might have an image reference field in here. So use the list.xml file and the update.xml file to both provision your lists and content types and populate your lists. Now, if we look at this one here, you'll see we have a data node, we have rows underneath that, and then we have row nodes. In this case, we're going to add 2 rows. So we're going to populate this list with these 2 different row sets. If a field is required, you must have it here. In this case, we're going to add these 2 rows. Title, in the content types we typically use, is required to be unique. It's required, and it's required to be unique. So if I were to try to add this row and it already and there was already a row that had a title value of a Kumina sample, this would not get added. I wouldn't have 2 rows. It would just simply not add this. It would refuse to do it. But what do I do if I want to modify a row? If I want to modify a row, I make sure my title field matches, and I set update equals true right here. Actually, it's all caps. If I set update equal true, then the deployer is going to look for a row with this title and modify the other fields to match what I have here. It's a great way to modify or update a row. I know you're not doing multilingual, but if you were doing multilingual, not only would the title be unique, but you would also have to include the language information. So which language version did you want to update? But update allows you to update rows that already exist. Maybe you want to change something in navigation. Setting no update here, setting update equals false, means that it's going to add this, but only if it's not already there with that title. The lists and update list XML files give you the ability to provision lists, content types, and populate those lists so that you can build out your data structures. Very often, when I build widgets and widget libraries, I'll design them from the data level up, which means I have to have list data in there to drive them. Maybe that list data is used for configuration. Maybe I want to give my content authors the ability to manage the information displayed in that widget. So I want to create a list so that I can add a content app. Lists and content types are very powerful and give you a lot of capability to populate your site. But what about how your site looks? Yesterday, we talked about the concept of a master page. That's sort of the framework that surrounds all of your pages. That master page can be found in Content Templates Master Page. I'll open one up here so you can see it. This is about as simple a master page as you can get. We've got some divs here that are required just for the structural layout. And without these divs, it's not going to quite work for you. And then we have this page component tag. Now, we're not going to deploy this master page because I take that back. With our Hive site, we have actually a really cool master page that we're going to take a look at here in a moment. But I do want to point out this page component tag. This is the part of your master page that really is where the rubber meets the road. If I navigate around the site, everything outside of this tag is never going to change. It's going to be all this stuff. It's the stuff inside this tag that's dynamically loaded based on the design of my page, based on that virtual page definition down here, and the widgets that go in it, and the content that the widgets display. They're all going to go in here. Now, as I mentioned, this is about as simple as you can get with a master page. We're going to go out here and take a look at what the Hive site master page looks like. Let's download it real quick. You may notice a difference. We support both standard HTML markup master pages as well as React-based master pages. We generally recommend now using the React-based master page. It's just going to run faster. The way it loads and renders is much better. So if you're not too familiar with React, start with one that already exists. So start with a master page from an existing site and work around it. Is anybody here not familiar with React?
I have not used it before.
Okay. It's basically just a way to build your HTML using this React.create element. And as you can see, it's nested. So here, this is an example where I'm creating an LI. Those are all the attributes. And so, yeah, so if you're not familiar with it, I definitely recommend starting with an existing one just so you can get a feel for it. But that's basically all you're doing here is you're building the HTML using.
I can see, yeah.
Yeah. And so I wanted to point out though, look at this. Right here, I'm creating an element. In this case, it's going to be a nav tag. It's got some CSS classes in it. It's got this one right here that's really important, AK widget wrapper. When you're adding widgets to your master page, they need to be inside a tag that has a class of AK widget wrapper, because that's what tells the system that there's a widget in there for you to process. Because the next element we see here is a div tag, and it has a widget instance name. It has a class of AK widget. That class has to be there, and the unique ID of that widget instance. This is what we call a widget snippet. They're typically div tags. They don't have to be, but they do have to have the rel attribute, which is the name of the instance, a class that contains AK-widget, and the unique ID of that instance. This will ultimately get rendered as your top navigation. Here's a site alerts widget. Here's a breadcrumb widget. You'll see that all the way throughout, but all of them are wrapped inside an element with AK widget wrapper. In this case, each one has one element around it of AK widget wrapper. That's not necessarily the case. You can have multiple widgets inside a single element with that class. That just tells the system in the master page that there's a widget in there. And like I said, you can have more than one. So if we scroll down here a little bit, it looks like we're still in the header. Here we go. There's our page component. So just like the HTML form that we just saw, the React form, you do the same thing. This is going to be what represents our entire dynamic page. If I were to create a page in the designer or create a page using the source, all of its structure will replace this right here. You can get that master page from your Acumen library, digital workplace, content templates, master page folder. And there it is.
And have you guys used Azure Storage Explorer before?
Yes, I've used it a lot.
Yeah,
Okay,
and so
good.
like the key information that we shared in the env file is how you would like connect to get here.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So yeah, so that's basically the idea behind the master page. Once you upload it, you do need to configure where that master page is coming from. So if we go out to your site here, go to the debug panel. Oh shoot. Actually, I take that back. I'm used to doing it on the SharePoint side. That's actually configured in your site settings within your app manager. So I'll make a note. Tyler, make a note. We need to dig up the specific place where we configure which master page file is used for headless. I can't remember. So we will get back to you on where you set that. If you decide to change your existing master page, just make sure you keep a backup. So that's something that you would want to keep in your source control, for example. Now, we have a CSS folder here. You'll notice that there's a file in here, digitalworkplace.custom.css. If I open it, it's nice and empty. The digitalworkplace.custom.css file is the file that you will use to alter the CSS of your site. You're already going to have a bunch of CSS out there. It's if it's a Hive implementation, for example, it's already there. But this is the place where you put your own special stuff. As like I said, as you can see here, it's empty. But if I wanted to, say, give something a class, maybe go bold font weight. Right now, I can add that style. I upload this using the CDN asset step, and I will have that file uploaded into my Azure storage. So if I were to go back out here, it would show up right here. You notice we have a few other CSS files. Those are necessary. This, your file, will be the last CSS file to load, which means if you've got a class out there in, say, the broadcast center or digital bootstrap or something, if you got a class out there that's not what you want in your style, just update it, override it in your digitalworkplace.custom.css file. That'll make it so that your styling is updated or is applied last. And if with CSS, the last is what matters. So that's where you do that in this file right here. It's always going to be called digitalworkplace.custom.css. Tyler, this will go along with the master page question. There's for headless, there's actually a configuration file that defines all of the like which master page you're using, what CSS files you're using, and so on. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. This one's already included, but if you wanted to add your own, you could do that too. So if you wanted to add a, like a veracity.custom.css or some other CSS file, you can absolutely do that. But there's, like I said, there's a config file you'll need to add that in. We're going to actually look at the JS file after, but you'll notice it's the same structure. The one in your sample site definition has a bunch of example code in it. So that's why I include it. So it's got some nice, good example code in there, but we'll look at that after the break in the second half of training today. At this point, I want to talk about the term store. The term store is, if you're not familiar with that in SharePoint, it's about as simple a list of terms as you can get. And you can define it here. Term stores are broken up into term sets. Each term set has a name. You'll notice that there's no other attribute here. That's how simple these things are. Within each term set, you'll have a list of terms. Again, the terms simply have names. So in this example, it's pretty simple. It's a taxonomy with 4 values: HR, technology, financial, and equipment. I think that actually came from a project I worked on for an onboarding flow years ago. Term sets, however, can also be nested. So here's one. It has a set of terms in it. Each term has child terms. So in this case, I've got one called My Training Nested Taxonomy. It has a user and a developer category. And within each of those users, we have author and admin. Under developer, we have architecture, site definition, virtual pages, widgets. Note, we can have spaces, but this gives me a nice nested taxonomy. You want to use taxonomies when you're when you want to give your users the ability to create content and then apply things like metadata to it. We saw that in the authoring example yesterday, where we had terms, departments, and regions. Those are all taken from the term store. So use the term store when you need taxonomic information to be visible and available to the user. If I go back to the Learning Center, scroll back up here, I think we have one in here that uses taxonomy. No, we don't have that in this example. Tyler, let's make another note. I have a list sample that actually uses taxonomy. If you guys need to know how to add a reference in a list to the taxonomy tree, just let me know and I can grab a list that has that. I just don't have one available for me right here. All right, and we are going a little fast. Have you guys, as we've gone through, do you have any questions? Do you want me to rehash anything before I move on?
Hey, Brad, can I ask a question just to confirm my
Mm-hmm.
understanding of something? So, like a content type is like the, I guess like the metadata around something. So like you define your like column, like names, column types, etc. But then a list is an actual like instance of like an item in that content type. Is that correct?
Well, you can think of a content type as a template for a list.
Okay.
So in SharePoint, if I want to create a list, I can go in there and say I want this field and with this type and that field with that type. But if I'm going to create a bunch of lists that all have, say, the same sets of fields, instead, I can create the list and say, I want to create a list, but I want to use this content type to create it.
Gotcha.
So the content type is like a blueprint for the list. Yeah, so anytime I want to create a list with these fields, for example, all I have to do is say that I want to use this content type, and then it's going to provision that list with all of these fields. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thanks. That makes sense.
Sure. And again, if I want to inherit, if I want to say create a list that's the Acumen news experience type and has all the Acumen important dates fields, I can do that just by inheriting both of them. And you just do that like this. So you just inherit them with a comma separated list. And if I do that, I'm literally going to get all of the fields from both of these content types. And in fact, this is one that I do often. It's combine these two because then it gets me all the basic content stuff, but it also gets me everything about dates, so I can assign extra date information to it. Any other questions about what we've covered so far?
Yeah, Brad. Going back to the master page, we used a React to create the components, all the HTML elements. Uh, can I use? I can do the same using jQuery as well, right? So, is there any restriction like we have to go with the React only?
Yeah, in the current version, you will have to use React.
Okay.
But the widgets themselves
Widgets you can use
can use
React.
whatever they're.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with widgets you can use React, you can use jQuery, you can use anything you want, but the master page now has to be React.
So I think the master page is just your site structure, right? Like your
Right.
things that are on every single page.
Yeah, so for example, here,
Nav.
yeah, everything from here up and everything in the footer is part of the master page. Everything out here in the middle. Oh, and by the way, this mission control, it's also part of the master page. But everything else out here in the middle is going to be page dependent. So if I go, into one of these articles, you can see how the header doesn't change, or, well, that's interesting. Oh, looks like I'm having connection issues with that. Let's see if it'll work this time. I've never seen that before. Okay. Well, we'll come back to that. But yeah, it basically, no matter where you go, everything in the master page stays the same.
We've been getting those errors in like your email things, but then after a second or a few seconds, they load in.
Yep. All right. But yeah, so yeah, that's the one thing. Master page has to be React now. Just don't forget the page itself. All the variable stuff that gets loaded is buried somewhere in here.
And then you can have a new master page if you have a subsite that has different
Yeah. So
structure.
if we go back out here, you'll notice that there's actually 3 master pages out here. By the way, these are all the templates for your widgets, for example. Yeah, so you see here we got the Hive, we've got the Hive department. So that's a subsite right there. And this was the original master page that has virtually nothing in it. And so these two are being used. This is just part of the core deployment. That's why it's still here. This will never get used, but these two are referenced.
Does that core one just load the other ones or something? Just guessing.
No.
SharePoint needs that to exist or something, right?
Yeah, that's
like that.
there, but we take it away as soon as we reconfigure these.
I see.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky because this has to be here in order to deploy these. But then once we deploy them, we just dereference that one.
Okay. Okay, cool.
All right. So the last thing I wanted to cover before we take a short break is the idea of populating libraries. I talked about it just a little bit earlier. Oh, and actually one thing I haven't talked about as we've been going through, I do want to talk about some of these steps. So in Classic, master page is only for Classic, so we don't need that step. JS and CSS, those are only if we're deploying to SharePoint. We're deploying to headless. We don't need that. We do need lists. That's what executes this list.xml file. By the way, you'll notice we don't have content types over here. What happens is if I execute the list step, it's going to execute this XML file here. And if in that file I reference a content type, it's going to look for that content type in here and either use it or provision it. So the lists step is what ultimately controls creating that content type if I use one. Same thing with update lists. The update list step right here, if I have a file in this list definitions folder called update.xml, singular, update.xml, it's going to execute the same thing. It's going to work just like lists, but it's going to do it for the update lists file. Same thing, if I have a content type in there and it isn't already provisioned, it's going to provision it from this file. All right, some other steps that we don't use in modern and or headless. We don't use the layouts, pages, or controls step in modern at all. We're going to see how that works with virtual pages after the break. We will use the widget step. We're not going to use that right now, so I'm going to go ahead and set that to false. We can use the group step. The groups step creates user group affiliations. We're not even going to talk about that during this training, but if you want to learn more, take a look at that in the Learning Center. We will use content files, or no, we're not going to use content files or image files, because remember, we're using the CDN assets step. So you notice a lot of these steps aren't really necessary for us. Homepage is only valid in Classic. Fonts is valid in all situations. We're just not going to touch on that, but it's similar to some of the other files. We are going to use the virtual pages step. After the break, we're going to add some additional steps here. And actually, I take that back. I'm going to add one right now because we're going to talk about this upload files. We briefly touched on it a few minutes ago. We're going to go into a little bit more detail here. Fact, do we have, oh, we actually don't have, we're going to actually add three steps right now that aren't in the sample here. I'm going to put them right here. Yeah. All right, so I've added a step called virtual layout. Virtual pages and virtual layouts we're going to look at after the break. There's that term sets. So for terms, I have to add term sets and set that to true. If I want to upload files to my file libraries, or to any of my libraries within SharePoint. As I mentioned earlier, I need to have a folder in here called upload files and a folder that matches my library name in SharePoint, and then any files or folders that I want to upload into it. Any folder that I have underneath this upload files folder that matches an actual library in SharePoint will get processed with the upload files step. So anytime I want to make sure that assets actually get into SharePoint versus going to my headless site, they need to be in here, and the library needs to already exist. And I set upload files to true to deploy that. And then those will actually go out to my SharePoint libraries instead. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and just take about a 15-minute break. So it's 9:05 basically right now, my time. So let's meet back at 20 after the hour. When we get back, we're going to talk about how to build virtual pages, virtual page layouts, and then we're going to get into some examples of how to take advantage of, say, eventing, callbacks. What are the custom page steps and page load steps and things like that? And we'll talk about caching as well. So after the break, we're going to build some virtual pages, and we're going to actually, that's going to be an exercise. So we're going to actually all get to build our own virtual page if we want and deploy that. So we'll meet back at 20 after the hour.
Sounds good. Thanks.
right, welcome back, everyone. Once you return, I should have said this before the break. Once you return, just raise your hand so I know you're back.
How do I raise my hand?
That's fine.
In Teams, there's a reactions button now
Oh,
at the
gotcha.
top. All right, so we're just waiting for Brock, and then we'll get started.
I like how they even have it ranked, like they can tell you who raised their hand first. So if you want to like take questions, they can tell you who is up first.
Yeah, I mean, they keep improving that. I'm really liking it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as soon as Brock's back, we'll get started, and we'll start building some virtual pages.
I'm here.
You are awesome. Okay, so having you raise your hand is actually an important thing because we're going to be doing some exercises this afternoon, in this half of the training this morning, as well as tomorrow. So as we go through, I'll say, go do this, and then once you're done doing whatever it is I ask you to do, just raise your hand, and that way I know that we can move on. Or of course, anytime you have questions, I could say raise your hand for questions, but really, if you have questions, just shout out. All right. So one thing I can't do is lower everybody's hands. So go ahead and lower your hands, and we'll move on. All right, so let's talk about virtual pages. In your sample site definition, you got one called training.json. I'm going to have you make some changes to this, but then we're going to deploy it together so we can see how that looks. So what I'd like you to do is change the name of your page. Maybe just add your name to the beginning of the name there. And we're going to need to change this ID. So just delete that. If you go to the command prompt here, the command palette, one of the options is insert GUID. That's an easy way to get a GUID that's unique. So all of our IDs, for the most part, are GUIDs. You're going to see in the virtual page layout example that we're using an ID that's not a GUID. We probably should. And so we'll change that as well. So once you have changed the name of your page and given it a unique ID, you can use any GUID generator you want for that, but it does need to be unique, or we're going to end up writing over each other. Once you finish doing those two things, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll continue.
Can you show me what to click again? I missed that. To get the unique.
Yeah. So if you go up to the view command palette.
Okay.
And then if
Insert
insert
GUID.
GUID is not the first option, you can just start typing it.
Oh, I got no matching command.
You can go to Google and Google GUID generator, Brock.
Yeah.
You can also get
you
something.
can do that. I wonder if that's a plugin I got at some point. But yeah, you can just go to Google and Google, or the browser, and do Google or Google. As Tyler said, GUID generator.
It's funny. The link was purple. I've used this before.
Oh,
I don't remember.
I used to use one called GUIDgen.com, but it went out. It's gone. So
I used GUIDgenerator.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
a good
use
one.
that.
All right. Okay. So great. So yeah, so we got everybody needs to have a unique name and a unique ID for their page. The reason for that is because that ID is truly the identifier of your page. If we have two pages with the same identifier, whoever deploys last wins. so you don't want to do that. A couple other things that are important. Once you actually deploy a page with a name and an ID, don't change it. As soon as you change the ID, you're going to get a new page. But it's going to have the same name as another page, and that's going to get really confusing. The name's not really used for any kind of true identification other than it's a friendly name when you're looking at the pages in different lists and so on. All right, so every page is of type generic page, and all of them have their data stored in a list called generic pages _AK. Someday down the road, we may have different types, but right now, that's the only type and the only list for it. We also have this additional select columns that's placeholder for future functionality. One other thing I do want you to change is go ahead and change your URL. Again, if we have two pages with the same ID, or with different IDs but the same URL, that's going to cause real problems. So definitely also give it a unique URL. You'll notice the structure here, /site pages / the name of your page .aspx. That's always going to be the format for pages. The name here and the value of the page doesn't have to match, but I do recommend they match at some level. This is ultimately going to be this name. This is going to be the title of your page. So in the browser. Now, I mentioned yesterday that we have the ability to create page versions. This structure is a simplified format when you're building a page that only has one version. You will always have this personas field here. You must have the all value when you're doing a single page like this one. We're going to look at what the variable or the variations look like later. Every page has a definition. The definition contains or has containers, and it also has rails. In addition to that, it has options. We're going to see what that looks like. You'll notice here we're not using the rails, we're just simply using containers. Containers are going to be the rows for your main body of content. All containers are rows within your page. Each row or container has a layout. We're going to look at the 11 different layouts, or is it 17? I think it's 17 different layout options shortly. Within each row or container, you'll have columns or zones. In this case, since I'm only using a one column layout, I only need one zone. But you'll notice here, this is, if you're familiar with JSON at all, this is an array format. So I could add a second zone just by putting a comma in and going in like that. So I could add a second column there. I could say, okay, well, I want to make that a 2-column layout. So now I've got a 2-column layout page. You don't have to do this. But that's what it is. It's anytime, and the syntax or the syntax of this data structure is kind of revealing. You'll see zones, plural. That means I can have more than one. Containers is plural. That means I can have more than one. So there's a container, which is a row. Right? If I wanted to add a second row, I'd do the same thing. I could just repeat what I have here, put a comma in, and separate it. Need to give my second container a unique ID. Right? The containers must have a unique ID for each within the page. Your zones must have unique IDs within the container. So I can leave these alone if I wanted to. All right, I'm going to simplify it back down. Undo my changes here. All right,
Hey,
get it back down to the basics.
Hey, Brad,
So
this is like a super simple question, but just to confirm, so like the containers are the rows of widgets on a page.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, if we go out to a page, let me go into a simple page here. Yeah, we'll just go into this about page right here. So I go into this page and I hit edit. You'll see here this column 1 and column 1. If I scroll down, This is not behaving. This is not behaving well at all. I could add a row to this page if I wanted to. Those are containers. Within each container, I have, so 17 different layout options. It's a 12-column grid, but we don't go shorter than 2 columns wide in any particular zone. So we've got a 12-column wide here. We've got 2 zones each, 6 columns wide. I think this one's 2 and 8. Yeah, this is 3 and 9. Or yeah, so 2 and 10, 10 and 2, 3 and 9, 9 and 3. You can get the idea. 3, 3 and 3. Or I guess 4, 4 and 4 actually. Sorry. But yeah, so that's the idea. These are all 6 columns, two columns wide each. And so for each row, you can do this. Now, each of these layouts has a name. Back out of this. Yeah, it's interesting. Each one of those has a name. So if I go out to the Learning Center and I go to Virtual Page Builder, if I jump in here and I scroll down a little bit, we can see that. So by the way, and we're going to look at this JSON format here in a minute. So yeah, each one has a name. So 17 different versions, 1 column, 2 column, 2 column large right, 2 column large left, and so on. So this page is really nice because it shows you the names of the layouts, but then you get a feel for what the structure of the layout is. And that's that layout in the column or in the container right here. So that layout ID right there. So a couple of things about the zones. Those zones are going to be these visual areas. So in this case, 6 zones. This is just 1 zone. If I have a layout ID that specifies more zones than I specify here, so maybe I do 6 column, but I only do 1 zone, I'm just going to be able to populate the first zone. The other 5 are still going to be there. I'm just not putting anything in them. When I'm building a page, if I want to put a 6-column zone in or a 6-column row in there, and I know I only want to populate that first column, I don't have to specify the rest of them. I can leave them blank, and that's fine. The other way works too. Let's say I specify more zones than I have in my layout. So in this case, layout ID is 1 column. If I specify 2 zones, the second zone is just ignored. If I were to deploy this with 2 zones and maybe I put widgets in both zones and I specify layout ID of 1 column, I'm only going to see the widgets in the first zone. But if I were in the user interface and I switched that layout to 2 column, the widget that I'd already specified for the second zone might show up. I actually don't know if it will, but I don't see why it wouldn't. So having the layout ID and the zones mismatch really just defines whether you see something or not. It's not really going to break anything if they mismatch. You just may not see the zones you're expecting. Now, what do we put in zones? Well, we put widgets in zones. And I'm going to give you a sneak preview of what we're going to do tomorrow. Let me pull up my text snippet here. To define a widget for a zone, you just pop in a structure like this. So in zone 1 here, I'm going to put some widgets. Notice it's plural, which means I can put more than 1 widget in that zone if I want. Technically, I can put 0 in. Each widget's going to have a title. This is going to be the name of the instance of the widget and that instance ID. It's also going to have the name of the widget type. Those 3 values, title, widget, instance ID, and name, are the only required values in this. But you do have to have all the fields. I mentioned yesterday that widgets have instances. Instances define that widget. They're the car that you build from the blueprint for the widget. Normally, widget instances are stored globally. However, you can override an instance. When I'm inserting a widget into a zone like this, I do have to have an instance as a blueprint for my widget, but I can override all of its properties. I can even override the icon and description and the options values for that instance. When I do that, these values are stored in page, and I have a unique in-page instance of that widget. So why would I want to do that? So let's say I have a widget that is going to be on 17 different pages. And on each of those pages, one property is going to be different. Maybe it's got 20 properties, but only one changes from page to page. I could create one instance at the global level that has all of those property values set except for that one, and then do an in-page override on that one property value. So in my app manager, I just see the one instance, but in each of the pages, I see a unique version of that. So it helps manage it. I don't have to override it. I can always do my widgets globally. It's up to you. The last two values help me organize the widgets within this zone. Let's say I want to have a page with a reasonably complex layout. And within that layout, I need to put, say, 3 widgets side by side. No, 3 widgets vertically in one zone, but then the other 2 zones, maybe on that row, I just want 1 widget in each. I can do that by adding multiple widgets in here, but comma separating them. If I need to control the order that they show up in that zone, I can add an index or an ordinal here. Anytime the 2 ordinals match, they're just going to go in the order that they were listed here. If the ordinal, let's say I name these 3, 2, 1, well, then they're going to show up last, first, first, last. If I set a grid value greater than 1 here, then it's going to stack the widgets horizontally to that number, if it can. It's very semantic, but let's say I set this grid value to 3. As long as those 3 widgets can fit in the zone side by side, it will try to put them in side by side. This is responsive, which means if I shrink the display, those may not fit 3 across. But it will never put more than 3. So if I set that to 3 and I put, say, 6 widgets in this zone, it will never put more than 3 side by side in that zone. This ability to set multiple widgets in a single zone, control their order, and control their layout semantically makes it so that you can create some pretty complex layouts. Now, we're not going to put this widget in here today. We're going to do that tomorrow. So I'll take that right back out. And as you can see, you can have a zone that just has nothing in it. If we go back over here to the Learning Center, I'm going to scroll back up here. And we're going to look at 2 other examples. So here's an example. Again, it's a 1-column, 1-zone page. It's a single version page. So there's only one version there. It's got a widget in this zone, so you can see that format right there. But if I scroll down here, within my page definition node, I also have this rail model node. The rail model node allows you to stack widgets to the left and right of your main content area. Your main content area will always be that 12-column structure, but now the page also has 12 columns, with your main content area being a fraction of that. So in this particular case, I'm saying I want a stack of widgets that takes up 1/4 of the page on the left, another stack that takes up 1/4 of the page on the right, and my main content area is gonna take up the middle half. That middle half is divided into those 12 columns managed by the layouts here. Does that make sense? I think it
Yeah, it makes
does.
sense.
Good. All right. The challenge with that is it's hard to see it without visually seeing it, but that's when you want to just start playing around with it. All right, so we can stack widgets to the left and right of that main content area. Remember I mentioned the idea that widgets are placed on a page using a snippet and the unique ID of the instance. So up here, my widget instance ID is inside this structure, but for the rail, really all I have to do is say which rail I want my widget in and the unique ID of the instance. I can alternate left and right. It doesn't matter. It's just going to take all the ones that are identified as left, put them in the left rail in the order they show up here. All the ones identified as right, put them in the right rail in the order they are in this list. Now there are 3 rail types. I got to find the rail type here. Here we go. There's another view of the rail types. Here we go. 3 rail types: left focus, right focus, and center focus. What does this mean? Well, center focus means that I'm going to have a rail on both sides of my main content. Right focus means I'm going to have a rail to the left of my content, which is on the right. Left focus means my main content's on the left, my rail's on the right. So it's a little peculiar because I'm basically saying, well, if it's rail type 1, my rail's on the right. If it's rail type 2, my rail's on the left, right? And if it's rail type 3, I've got a rail on both sides. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's a bit weird, but you're talking about the focus of the main content, not the focus of the rail when you see this. Within the rail model, I can also specify some CSS classes for the rail, for my left column, my right column, and my center column. This helps me define any kind of CSS that I might need. So it gives me some extra CSS that I can add in there to control the layout. Now, that's for, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So what is the difference between using the rail model and if I use the configuration out of those 17, which has, maybe we have 6 in the center, 3 on both sides. Like in one row, I have 6 columns in the center and 3 on the sides, and the rail configuration which we have, like with say the center focus. So what is the difference?
I'll show you the difference. So we're going to go out to this page again. Right now, I have no rails on this page. I'm going to go ahead and add a couple. So if I add 2 rails, so do dual rail. And I think I have to put some widgets in. So hold on a second. Let's do some local news there and something like that. So just add some bogus widgets in here so we can see it. What it's going to do when I add the rail is it's going to just simply squeeze my main content area down to fit between the 2 rails. This still has 12 columns to it, no matter how wide it is. So if I go in here and I want to change my, oh, I got to edit again. If I go in here and I want to change the layout of this middle part, go to toggle row editing here. I still have my 17 options and I can still use 12 columns out of that. So regardless of the rails, I always still have 12 columns in here to play with. But the page itself is divided into 12 columns when we're talking about rails. So in this particular case, if I go back to the rail layout, I'm only using 50% of the page for my 12 columns in my main content. Now I'm using 100% of the page for those same 12 columns.
I'm sure I can just figure this or experiment and figure this out. But when you do responsive on that, can you control what order the rails come in versus the content? Because sometimes designers want the right nav thing to pop above.
Here's the tricky part. The left rail is always going to show up in responsive ahead of the main content, and the main content will always show ahead of the right rail.
Okay. I mean, that makes logical sense. I've just had instances where they've not wanted it that way.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, but that's just the nature of responsive.
Always
right?
painful. Yep.
Yeah, it's always going to be in the order that it shows up in your markup, and that's the order. So left rail, center, right rail. Yeah,
we've had to just, when it goes below a certain size, like change it, just show a different thing. Super fun. Okay.
One of the things I do is below a certain size, in my CSS, I'll hide the rails behind like a tag, so a button off the side, and then that way my center content shows up at the top, and my rails essentially are just hanging off the side like the mission control tab.
That would work.
Yeah, that's usually the easiest.
Sounds good.
Okay, now what about pages that have multiple versions? I didn't put an example in the site definition for this training that has multiple versions because one, it's very rarely done, and two, it's a lot more complex, and I'll show you why. So in this example here, I have a page, it's got a name, it's got an ID type, just like before. But now I have this page versions node. Inside that, each version is going to have its own unique title, unique ID. It can have a unique name. This is more like a description, even though we do have a description. This is sort of a short description, long description for the page. Version, page version priority group, you have to have at least one with the type of, with the persona of all, and I'll explain what that means here in a little bit. The version can be deactivated, so it can be a valid version, but it's not active. You can disable it. Each version has its own set of properties, which are defined in this page here down below. And now we finally get down to the page definition and containers. So from here on, it's just like your single page, but now each version has all this extra stuff up here. And there's our versions, and we're done. Now, this is fine. This definition right here defines a multi-version page, but only one version in the definition. If I want more than one, remember that's plural. We got this curly brace here. I can repeat this entire structure for each version. The only difference is each version has to have a unique title, a unique ID, name and description or whatever you want, and each version should have a unique priority group. This is a persona. So again, you have to have at least one with the all persona. All the rest can specify what persona they apply to. Personas, remember, are groups of users that are based on user properties and logic around those user properties. So I could have, say, a page version that's for everybody that's in HR. I could have a page version for everybody that's, say, a new employee in IT in Boston, right? Because I can create a persona for that. But each one will have a single persona specified here. And that means the entire structure, all the widgets, the layout, everything in that page can be different from one persona to another. It can get quite complex quite quickly when you're dealing with personas, so just keep that in mind. Simpler is always going to be better. In here, we have a couple of good examples on those widgets. So here's another one where I'm using a particular widget instance, but in this particular case, I'm overriding its icon and I'm overriding its description at the page level. So maybe I want a different icon and a different description for that widget at each page. Here's one where I'm literally overriding all the properties of that widget. Now you'll notice in this particular case, I'm giving it a title. I'm using this new GUID tag, which is going to generate a new unique GUID for it. I can also just put a unique GUID in there. So what's happening here is I'm actually instantiating a new instance without even starting with an existing one. I can start with an existing one, but as you can see here, I don't have to. I'm giving it a new unique ID, which means I'm giving it an in-page instance, and there isn't even a global instance for it. That's why I have to define all my property values here. I do have to set that page specific value to true anytime I do that override. You'll notice up here, I didn't have to do that. I do have to do that if I don't have a global instance. And I do have to define the widget type. So this is a more complex way to insert a widget into a widget instance into a page that doesn't even exist. So I'm not even starting with an existing one. Here, I'm using an existing one. So two different good examples of how you can insert widgets into virtual pages. All right, that's virtual pages. We're going to deploy our sample one here in a little bit, but I want to talk about this virtual page layouts before we do. If we go here, oh, by the way, also rename your file here to match your name. We'll just keep it simpler. So you want your file name to match your name here. You want your URL to match. You want a unique GUID, so make sure you generated one. Now, if we look at the simple layout here, note it has a name, it has an ID. This should be a GUID. So let's fix that. There we go. It's always going to have a SharePoint layout ID of 2210. That's just the way it's structured. I cannot explain exactly how that works, but part of our core installation sets up some data that's necessary for this to work. So it always has to be 2210 for the SharePoint layout ID. Other than that, you just have containers like a page. So there's very little difference in here. Each row or container has a structure. In this case, I've got two zones. I can insert widgets into layouts. In other words, I can prep a page. Maybe I always want this page to have a navigation widget in it or something like that. Maybe I want to insert a page-specific widget and let it generate a unique GUID every time with that one tag. That's a great way to do it. So I can prep the page not only with layout, but also with widgets that have been constructed. I can also restrict the author or the page creator. So if I'm creating a page using this layout, I am not allowed to put any widget in this zone that is not one of these two types. I'm literally restricted to these two types in this zone, and I can't put any other kind of widget in there from the front end. This zone's nice and empty. I can do whatever I want with it. So this is a little bit more complex, and it gives you a variety of options there. Or I should say a little less complex than building a page, but it gives you those options, gives you the ability to put widgets in, layout, and so on. All right, so how do we deploy these? Once you have renamed everything.
Can I just ask another question just to confirm?
Yeah.
So what's the fundamental difference between a virtual page layout and a virtual page? Like, is the page definition just like you can specify like different types of pages, and then a layout is like yeah, I guess it's like one custom versus one's the out of the box Akumina.
Well, the difference is this. When I create a page, I go in here, I hit that plus button, I give it a name, I give it a URL, and then I start with a layout. So out of box, we got a bunch of layouts that are just already pre-built. But what we're talking about in that source is creating what's called a saved layout. So I can create a layout here that others can use to start with. So the layout's almost like a blueprint for a page.
Ah, gotcha. So virtual page layout is these like options we see here. Yeah. Whereas a virtual page is something that if you wanted to create your own that doesn't exist sort of out of the box, that's where you do it.
Uh-huh.
Gotcha.
All right, so let's actually do something with these pages. Let's see. I'm not going to have you guys deploy. Well, actually, yeah, we can do this. So for your layout, make sure you have a unique ID. Make sure you add your name to the layout here. Everything else can stay the same. Now, once you've done these changes, make sure you save your files. This is actually our first deployment today. And we're going to make sure every one of these steps is false except for.
Should we rename, sorry, simple layout?
Yeah, go ahead and rename it. Thank you. There we go. So you want to rename the file. Just make sure it's got a unique name, unique ID. Same with your page. Unique name, unique ID, unique URL. And then you'll need to add this virtual layout step and set both virtual pages and virtual layout to true. Note it's pages plural, but it's layout singular. Different developer did different things. So set both of those to true. Every other step can be false. You can leave all the other steps. I just deleted the ones I didn't need. And when you're ready, execute npm run deploy. As long as you were able to actually get through the first two videos before training, this should work for you. I haven't tried to deploy yet to this training site for myself. So let's see what happens for me. You'll see it's going to go through those steps. The first thing is add virtual pages. It's finding my JSON files. If I didn't do anything to break my JSON, it should work. And you'll notice it does take a few moments. What's happening here is it's actually populating actually four different lists in the SharePoint site itself. Page URLs, generic pages, actually page URLs underscore AK, generic pages underscore AK, page widgets, and layouts. All right, so I've deployed a couple. Let's see what happened. So I'm out here. And Tyler, it freaked me out when I was on this because this looks exactly like one of my sites, but I've added to one of my sites. And so I was like, where are the other widgets? Because I haven't added them yet. All right, but if I go here and I go to this search existing pages and I look for Brad, look at that. I have it. Now, if I don't see it here, I either got something wrong or the page didn't get cached. Used to be the pages didn't get cached unless you manually cached them. Now, if I find that, I click navigate, I should find my page. Ah, here we go. Yeah, so it's actually still not cached yet. Look at that. Please check if page exists and page cache is updated. Once you've deployed your pages, if you got errors, let me know. If you didn't get any errors, go ahead and raise your hand once you're deployed, because I don't want to move on until you're ready.
Can you show me the config JSON, the deploy site deploy one more time?
Oh, yeah, you want these two steps right here.
I got an error. Missing script deploy. I did npm run deploy. Was that right?
Yeah, it should be npm run deploy like that.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Okay. That means that you haven't been able to. What's that?
I got the same error too.
Okay. Let's take a look. So that tells me that things didn't get installed properly for you. We may get to come back to that, but go ahead and Brock, if you want to share your screen, I'm going to see if I can take a look.
Is it maybe that they didn't select React when they set up their project, Brad, potentially?
No, you actually want to say no to React when you set up these projects. We'll take a look here.
Just dropping my resolution slightly.
No worries.
I actually still have up my install, so you can, when I scroll up, so you can see. Anyway, here's what I got for this. Ignore this. I was just following this line that said run this.
Oh.
Anyway, here's my run deploy from here to here.
Okay.
Do a -G, npm run, G minus.
My terminal's in a weird state now.
NP.
I don't know. I think it's just a visual glitch. What did you say? NPM.
So we're gonna do a global command. So it's gonna be a -G.
Yeah.
npm run. So npm run. Sorry, backspace. Run -G. Then do deploy.
Okay. Just ignore the rest of this. I think it's a visual glitch.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
You can always close it, go back in. There you go. So now Uh,
I got the same error with -G as well.
So
Yeah.
I think because there's no I think isn't it usually in the package.json where you'd have like the run like commands usually
Yeah.
like you, and it's like my package JSON is blank for the most part except for Yeoman.
Ooh. Let's
So I think
see.
that's because basically I think it's looking there to see.
Yeah,
It should be.
Shminder and I
Yeah,
were getting errors when we allowed it to overwrite package JSON.
Oh, yeah.
So you can
Interesting.
see we did
Yeah, my package JSON has a lot more than yours.
right here where it says do not overwrite.
Okay.
We said
So-
I just
yes.
skipped that.
Or
Okay. I think that's all you need then.
I think Brad, if you send us the sorry, I guess it's different for me because I have an Akumina machine, but if you send us your package JSON, we could just run npmi in our current location,
Yeah.
and that should install everything.
Exactly what I was thinking. So Tyler, I'm gonna have you put it. I'm gonna email this to you and have you
Yep.
put this in the
OneDrive.
share. Yeah. All right, heading your way.
All right, super.
Yeah, that should take care of you because I was just kind of eyeballing your project and it looked like that was the only thing that was out of whack.
All right, it's
Yeah.
uploading. So if you just refresh it, you should see
Okay.
it now.
There you go. You give that a try, and if that works, share that around.
Just gonna copy paste because I'm lazy.
There you go.
Seemed easier than downloading it and putting it in the correct directory. Okay, I've saved that. What do you say, npm-i or something?
I think if you just put npmi, it should
Oops,
install.
not there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's terminal there.
Like that?
Yeah.
Well, I'm learning something today.
Not resolve dependency. You know, this looks familiar, doesn't it, Shminder?
Yeah, exactly. This was what we were getting while we
Yeah.
said we want to override the packages file.
So we actually should have dug into this
Yeah.
while resolving. Uglify Webpack plugin.
So now, but if you run the run deploy command, it's giving some other error which says couldn't find the exe module.
Oh, I wonder if that got blocked.
Oh, by like.
Yeah, open your node modules. Or actually, maybe hang on, maybe under tools. Never can remember. Yeah, open your tools folder. And you should have site deployer.exe.
Uh-oh.
Or
Oh
do
yeah,
you?
right here maybe. Akumina
Yeah,
site
yeah,
deployer.
there it is. You do have it. Okay. All right. Well, that's good news. Yeah, that all looks like it's correct.
Okay.
And then, yeah, go ahead and pop open node modules. Yeah, let's see. if you can jump on that.
Uglify was the one that was yelling.
Yeah. Yeah, do you have an uglify-js?
Nope.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm just gonna. This is a big folder. I'm trying to think probably what the best way would be to.
Well,
I think I'm just gonna zip the entire node modules folder.
Oh God.
Yeah, that's huge. That's like 20 meg.
There is a dash force or
Yeah, you can try that.
dash legacy peer depth.
Try the legacy peer depths.
I used a Node a lot 3 years ago, but I've forgotten it almost entirely. Would it just be like this? Or it'd be run, wouldn't it? Or NPM.
I think
this
no,
was
it's
I was
NPM
running I, yeah, with force.
NPM I and then do force and see. And yeah, unfortunately, I know just enough Node.js to be dangerous.
Yeah, okay.
I think you can
That
probably
looks
say that
good.
about everybody.
Yeah, I almost was gonna make that same comment. Even the pros might say the same thing. Every time I've used Node, I've run into stuff like this.
Oh yeah. Trying to do something.
Yeah, it's definitely
Yeah.
running.
It's showing me 5 high severity vulnerabilities, but I don't know if that's okay, cause a problem.
Let's see if I got it.
Yeah. You do.
Yep, it's coming in.
All right.
What did you say, Shaminder? I didn't follow that.
After running this, for me it says it has 5 high severity vulnerabilities. I don't. Yeah, so you got the same.
Yeah.
Usually you can ignore
you can just
that.
not worry about those.
I don't think I've ever
those
run
are always
anything
there.
without getting a warning.
Yeah, I think unless it's not critical, I think it's fine.
You're right. All right, let's
So-
try that one more time. NPM run deploy. Let's see
Okay.
what happens. Fingers crossed.
Right. I think it's doing something this time.
Promising.
Who knows if I got the files right?
Right. Well, and that's one thing, through tomorrow as well, every once in a while I'll be pasting stuff into the chat. Beware, paste that through Notepad before you put it in anything, because Teams adds control characters in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it can really mess you up, because you sometimes what I'll do is I'll even tell you to just get rid of any line breaks and add them back in,
Yeah, copying and pasting out of Teams we've had a lot of trouble with too.
Yeah.
It's always one weird thing we had. The Akumina URLs themselves, when we were pasting them into chat when we were doing our dev install, when you click the link, it was not working. So it looked like our stuff wasn't working, but it was just Teams adding crap into the URL.
Of course, yeah.
Like, yeah, all you had to do is go to the last character and back up and type it. So there's some invisible character at the end or something.
Yep.
Like, what are you doing, Teams? Just leave it alone.
Right, yeah. By the way, if I do have a hard stop today and tomorrow at the time that I had Tyler adjust the meeting to. If we run out of time, we can always pick up next week. There's a small group here. We can always pick up next week to finish. I just want to let you know that
Okay.
I don't want to leave you hanging at the end. We can always add time next week. Thursday or Friday next week for me.
I appreciate that.
Sure. This is
Shaminder,
taking a while.
yeah.
Hmm.
I was gonna ask Shaminder if he did this, if it went through this step, or if it's also sitting there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think yours just stopped.
yeah, it executed for me, and after that, it showed me some other command.
Oh,
which
there we go.
executed.
Oh,
It
Yeah.
just took forever.
okay.
Awesome. This is good news. This means that you'll actually be able to complete the exercises tomorrow too.
Great. That's good.
All right. That looks good. So I'm going to take the screen back.
Okay. Thank you for getting me through that.
You bet.
Us. Yep.
All right. So once that completes, if you go out to your page, you're going to see it in the list. If you go to the search existing pages off the tray, you're going to see your page. Let's see what we got out here. Yeah, look at that. We got a few training pages.
Nice.
So, but we're going to get 404s if we go to them, right? So that's because your page still needs to be cached. All pages, it's not going to, if it doesn't find a page in the cache, it's not going to go try to cache it. It's for performance reasons. If it isn't in the cache, it doesn't exist. So the fix for that is to go out to your app manager, and then you can go to your page manager. So in management apps, and I'll just do it so you can see it here. And then what you want to do is find your page. You can just search for it. So we can do training. And it's autocomplete. So as soon as I type 3 characters, it's going to search for it. So here we go. We got some training pages here. And all we have to do is click cache over here on the right. We can also cache all pages. 26 pages takes a little while. So we'll just do these individually. And as long as everybody used unique URLs, which it looks like it, as long as everybody used unique URLs and unique IDs, come back out here, you should be able to just refresh your page and see it. Now it's going to look pretty empty because we haven't put any widgets in it yet. And actually, yeah, so everything from the bread, including the breadcrumb, everything from that up, and everything from this how do you like the internet down, including the mission control button here and this background. Everything you see here is part of the master page. I'm going to go to my page so that you can try this if you want. If I go to Brad training, that was the one I created, it's going to look exactly the same. And that's because we haven't put any widgets in it. If I click edit over here, I'll see that I have column 1. If I click on toggle row editing, now I've got that box. I've got all the different options in there. We're not going to want to change our page because we're going to be changing it in source, but that gives you an idea of, on this particular site, how much of the page is the master page. And all of that stuff, our content's going to go out here in the middle. Tomorrow, when we build widgets, we're going to see that content in our sample page. All right, so we have built some virtual pages. We have, got to get back to my agenda here. There we go. So we built virtual pages. Those virtual pages are going to be containers for our widgets that we build tomorrow. Now, let's jump into some of the site artifacts. So I talked about how some things are in SharePoint, some things are in your headless site. Basically, everything in that CDN assets folder in your project goes into your headless site. Also, when we build widgets tomorrow, the JavaScript for those widgets, as well as all views for those widgets, are going to go into the headless site. Where do they go? All your widget views go in here in Acumen Library, Digital Workplace Content Templates. And basically the way it works is when you build your widget, you give it a folder to put your widget views in. I can actually just go into one of these folders. So here's one. Generally, default is your view name. If you don't think you're going to have too many views, that's fine. I generally recommend naming your views, giving your views a name that describes what they do. So if it's going to be a grid, just call it grid.html. If it's going to be a swiping banner, call it swiping banner. Give your view names something meaningful. But they're all going to go out here. There are a few folders that are unique, however, out here. Of course, the master page folder, but also this core folder. The core folder has a bunch of default templates that are used by the user interface. So for example, that 404 page that we just saw, that's this template right here. When we build widgets, there's a constant that points to this template so that we can use that constant to load a loading template for us. If you don't like the loading template, well, come out here and change it. There's no reason you can't do that, because right there in your project, it'll be under your CDN assets, content templates core. You could override that if you want. You can override any of these if you want. Just beware that's going to override them for the entire site. The core templates are really handy to take advantage of if you need them. If we go back out here, as I mentioned earlier, all of your CSS, you'll want to put in this digitalworkplace.custom.css file. You can add more. We need to get you info on how to tell the system what CSS files to load. All JavaScript that drives your site is in this JS folder. Again, anything you want to add goes in this file right here, digitalworkplace.custom.js. The digitalworkplace.env.js file, this is a handy file that allows you to specify environment-specific settings. So, for example, constants. Maybe on your dev site, you just don't want to have any caching ever. Well, you can set your cache level to 0 here, and it disables caching across the board. You could, on your production site, maybe you don't want your tray menu, or maybe you only want to show the tray menu under certain circumstances. You can add code in here in your production site that disables the tray menu. There's a constant for it. We'll actually look at constants tomorrow. That constant can just simply disable the tray menu if maybe somebody's not a part of the admin group or something like that, so that it never actually even tries to load. Every page has a certain set of life cycles steps that it goes through. If I go back out here, go to this debug panel, and actually we'll look at those constants here in just a moment. If we go to the performance tab, we go here to page life cycle, so it's kind of buried. These are all of the steps that the system goes through to load a page. And each one of these has a constant tied to it, so you can disable it. Here's an init tray. If I don't want that tray in that env file or in my custom JavaScript file, I can disable that constant. Here we go, the constants. All these constants, loader steps enable. If they're set to true, they're going to run during the page load. If it's set to false, that step won't run. So in that env file, you could set loader steps enable tray menu to false, and it just simply won't load your tray menu at all. It won't even try. So you're not ever in a situation where it loads and somebody clicks it before it goes away. It will just it just won't try. And we did look at some of these contexts yesterday. The one that I find most useful is the user information, or its user context is actually the variable. This thing's great. I can do all sorts of stuff. I can find out what the user's preferred language is. I can get their custom properties out of there. What's their title? What's their department? I can really take advantage of this to load things up. That's how on the home page it says "Good morning, Brad," because it's looking up my first name, and it's saying, "Oh, you're Brad," so I'm going to say "Good morning, Brad." Those are really handy. Page context. Let's say I go to a page and it's like, "Oh, I got a 404. What's going on here?" Well, if I don't have a page ID or a page version ID, then I'm missing something. So before we cached our pages, if we went to this page context, this would have been empty. There would have been nothing here because that page wasn't cached. So take advantage of these constants. Also, when you're dealing with, maybe you want to make a change to the master page, or maybe you want to do a React-based view for your widgets, you can write JSX up here in the source, hit compile, and it will give you the React down here. So it's a nice way to build React. And I can't remember my JSX. Let's see if a div works. There we go. So yeah, so here's an example, and maybe class equals widget. right? I hit compile, and there I get my React. So this is a really nice way, if you're familiar with JSX. JSX is kind of a declarative variant of HTML. It's a lot easier to write than React, but you can go in here and write your JSX, and it will give you the React that you need. So maybe you want to make a change to the master page. Go in here and fiddle with the markup to get the React that you need. So that's a nice handy tool there. So all of your assets, all of your files that drive your site are going to be out here in your blob under Acumen Library Digital Workplace. And you'll notice these 5 folders. These are your standard folders. All your templates go under content. I know you're not multilingual, but I did want to point this out. Under content language, you're going to have an en-us.js file. Anytime you're in the system and you see something that looks kind of weird, I'm going to download this so you can see it. And it's like a couple of curly braces and what looks like a class definition. What that is it's referencing this file. And the token file, even though you're not using multilingual, is actually really helpful because you can use it to store common strings. And it's going to go to my downloads folder, and I'll show you this. So, for example, if you see a token, so it's going to be curly brace common dot confirm, and then a closed curly brace. What that means is that the system is going to replace that with the string right here. For multilingual, this is really powerful because I can use this based on the language. So if I'm in the site in Spanish, I'm going to get the token back from the Spanish token file instead. So it's really automatic. But you're always going to have this file, en-us.js, with all these tokens in them. If you need to change one of those tokens, that's in here. So you'll need to know to do that. And you'll know that when you see a funky token, like I said, with these curly braces. I will show you an example. Let me get to the right folder here. One of the things you're going to get after the training is a widget best practices guide. It's a couple of years old, but I don't think there's anything in here that's no longer relevant. But I did want to point this out. If you're out in the app manager and you're looking at something and you see curly brace friendly name underscore is root curly brace, that's going to replace that label with the value from the token file. So you're going to see this a lot. There's a whole friendly name section out there. And so it's friendly name dot is root or dash is root or underscore is root. And it's going to pull that. And the section is called property friendly names. So it is important when you see that. When you're building widgets, I recommend using this friendly names structure to give your widgets labels. And that way the label can be stored in that token file. And if you want to, and the idea, the cool thing about that is, like, let's say list name is used and you have 10 widgets that all use of a field type or a property type that has a label friendly name list name. The token file says list name, but you want to change that for all 10 of your widgets. You only have to change that in one place. And you want to change it to pick a list, right? You change it in that one token file and it changes it everywhere. So you can take advantage of that. You're going to get this, by the way. This talks all about the widget building and different tips and tricks on building widgets the best way. I kind of digressed there, but I think it was important for you to see that. All right, we're going to learn more about other site artifacts as we go, but I want to talk about the concept of eventing and callbacks in Acumen. To do that, I'm going to jump over here into the console, and you can follow along with me if you want. I'll paste these things into the chat as well. So we're going to define a function. Where's the chat? There it is. And this is where you're going to want to paste this stuff into Notepad first. All right, so we're going to define a function like that. We can just do that right here in the console. All right, so now I have a function that I've already declared, a function called my function. It's real simple. It's got a debugger line, and it's going to pop up an alert. You'll notice that the function can ingest data. We'll see how that works here in a moment. Acumatica has an eventing system that allows me to map an event. Just put that in the chat. To map an event to a callback function. So in this case, I'm going to subscribe to an event called my event. They have to start with and end with a slash. You can have slashes in the middle if you want. I'm going to subscribe to this event, and anytime this event gets fired, I want it to run my function that I just declared. So you'll notice both cases, I've declared a function and I've subscribed and I've executed the subscribe method. The subscribe method has no response to it. Now, in order to run my function, I can simply publish that event. So notice the event is the same, it's matching it by string, and I can pass data in. When I do that, you'll notice it paused on my debugger line there. If I continue, and I go back to my site, wherever it is, there's my pop-up. And I'm displaying the data that I just ingested. Eventing is a very powerful mechanism throughout the system. That whole page load lifecycle, every one of those steps is powered by the eventing system. If you look in the custom JS file, you'll see this example. This gives you the ability to add additional steps. It's using the eventing system. It's just, you're just pushing your steps into a stack is what you're doing. And so you're saying after this step, I want to add this step with this callback. And so what happens is when this step is done, it fires an event, loader on executed, and the next step in the stack gets executed by its callback. So just like the eventing we just did, you can add additional steps right into the page load lifecycle using structure like this. That's why this example's in the JS file. You can also use eventing to communicate from one widget to another. Let's see, I'm going to go over to one of my sites here. This is a similar site, but I've got an example on here. Because events are driven by actions, so they're published. If I click on something, for example, I could publish an event, and the eventing architecture allows me to pass data, then what I can do is, if I want to create a complex experience, I don't have to build it all in one widget. I can build each element in a separate widget and allow the widgets to communicate. So here, this sales pipeline, this is pulling in some data, and you'll notice it's clickable. And in here, when I have a click event, when I click on any one of these, it's going to publish an event. These two widgets on load subscribed to that event. The first one is going to look at the account name that I click on and do a search out on the web for it. The second one here is going to look at the solution for the row that I clicked on, and it's going to filter this document library. Scroll up so you can see a little bit better. So if I click on Northern Trust, for example, it's now going to execute a web search for Northern Trust. This widget will filter by Digital Hub because that's there. So what's happening here is in my publish event, I'm passing an object that contains the account and the solution from this row. I think it actually contains all these values, so you can take advantage of that. So as I click around, I now have an experience where all three widgets are interacting with me, but they're separate widgets. So that eventing architecture really allows you to create that inter-widget communication to make it so that each of your widgets can be very encapsulated in its functionality.
Brad, do you have the code sample for The example which you showed us where widgets were interacting with each other.
We're actually, when we build widgets tomorrow, I'm going to actually show you where in the widget you can do that.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. And if you have more questions after that, please feel free to reach out. And I don't know if I have the source for those, but I can find it, I bet. All right, so I did want to point out that, okay, next exercise, we're going to talk about caching. So I'm going to go back to my console here. Akumina has a caching architecture. The caching architecture leverages local storage. Local storage is essentially in-browser data storage. It allows you to pocket all sorts of information. Our caching system puts a lot in local storage. Theoretically, local storage is infinite, but practically it is not. If your local storage starts to get filled up, your browser may start doing garbage collection. So our caching architecture is designed to basically handle that. How do you get a value out of the cache? Well, akumina.addin.cache.get, I'll paste this into the chat too, is how you get a value out. And you pass in a key. So if I do that, oh, I get null back. I got null back because either I have not set a value for this key of dev training, or it's expired, or local storage has garbage collected it. So let's go ahead and set one. Just put this in the chat as well. When I set a cache value, I give it a key, I give it a value, and I give it a duration. Note the constants, akumina.addin.constants, min cache expiration. That's by default 1 minute, but because it's a constant that you can change, you can make those constants be anything you want. If caching is disabled, by the way, that is 0. All right, so I've just put something on the cache. If I want to get it, there it is. In a minute, it's going to go away. While we're waiting for that minute to go away itself, I'm going to try to type Akumina. Let's take a look at some of these constants. So right up top, cache expiration. What is cache expiration? The cache expiration is determined by the caching strategy that you set in your app manager or your site itself. So your site settings. It's anywhere from off to, I think, heavy. So off, light, medium, heavy. There's a couple other settings. But what those settings do is they set a default value for the cache expiration constant. The others are all set as you would expect. Day, 4 hour, hour. Long is, I think, well, 360 minutes is what long is. I never could remember what long was. Minute. Short, I think is, yeah, short is 5 minutes. And then 2 hour. So use these constants. The cool thing about using the constants is you don't have to worry. Well, is it a minute? Is it 8 minutes? What is it? I don't care. I'm going to use whatever is set here. If your caching strategy is disabled, all of these will be set to 0. The value behind cache expiration is that I can say, maybe if I want to use cache expiration, so it's 10 minutes, for example, right? And the admin goes in and changes the caching strategy. What's going to change this value? So my widget is going to reflect the intent of the administrator of the system based on the value they set for the caching strategy. So I really recommend using that, maybe using a division of it, right? We probably don't want to do 2.5, but we can divide it by 5. So every time the caching strategy is set, my widget is going to refresh 5 times faster, or maybe I want to be 5 times as long. So use that to set your cache, and you're going to be a lot happier, and your administrator is also going to be a lot happier. There we go. So if I get it, you'll see it's null because it's expired. Now, this key is not a good idea. It's not a good idea because it's global across your entire local storage. So if somebody else set a cache value with a key of dev training, they've just overridden yours, or you could override somebody else's and really mess up the functionality. So instead, we recommend you calculate your cache key. And I'm going to put this in here. You're going to see this one tomorrow when we build widgets. It's used extensively. You can calculate the cache key like this. This value will be, when you build a widget, for example, will be the unique ID of the widget instance that you're currently executing. Remember, IDs are unique across the page. So no other widget on the page will have this ID. So I know in my page, within the page, I have a unique value. I'm going to actually pretend that that's my unique widget instance ID. And when I hit enter here, you'll notice what it gives back. Ecumena. So now we've namespaced it within ecumena.digispace. This ID right here is the ID of my page. Every page has a unique ID within the Ecumena world. So now I know it's an Ecumena key. I know it's in the digispace namespace. We used to actually call this digispace. The unique ID of my page. I now know I'm within Ecumena. I'm within this page. The unique language that my user is currently set to. The user ID that's viewing the page, and that unique instance ID. I know that this key is going to not only be unique across the site, but even within the user and language of that user. You're not going to get a duplicate key if you do that. So what we can do now, instead of setting our cache like that, go to set here, we can give it a better key. Now I know I have a unique key. So if I want to get that, right, dev training is still null. There's my value. And I know that no other attempt to get that value is going to make any sense, which means people are not going to be overriding my values. I'm not going to be overriding theirs. I strongly recommend that. So use ecumena.digispace.configuration context.get cache key, pass in a value that you know is unique on that page, and your scope will be correct. That unique value will be the unique instance ID of the widget that you're currently running. Any questions about caching? We're going to see that a lot more tomorrow when we build widgets. Excellent. All right, so that is the end of today. Tomorrow, we are going to learn all about how widgets work. What is a widget? What are the pieces that make up a widget? And we're going to all get to build and deploy our own widget. Just like today, you'll want to give your widget a unique name, and we'll work on how to do that. So we can each have our own unique widget deployed onto our unique training page. Not only are we going to build a widget, it's going to be just your basic hello world type of widget. We're going to learn how to take an existing widget and construct a unique instance of that widget. We're going to use what's called the generic list widget. That generic list widget that we're going to build an instance of, we're going to use that to get some list data and display that on the page. And then I'm going to show you how to replicate that same functionality in less than 5 minutes using a widget generator tool to produce a list widget of your own. We'll also talk a bit more about, we have a topic called deploying solutions. What it really means is we're going to talk about sort of the remainder topics that we didn't cover anywhere else. You'll learn how to add a widget to your master page. Well, we actually kind of saw that already. By adding that widget snippet in there, but we'll learn how to get that widget snippet. And after that, you get to play. You get to build widgets and try things out. So any questions over anything we've covered today before we break?
I'm good.
All right,
Same here.
fantastic. All right, well, thank you for your attention today. We will again pick up tomorrow building widgets and learning how to take all the stuff we learned today as far as how do you deploy a master page, how do you deploy content, things like that. We're going to learn how to put widgets and functionality into your site and use that content. All right,
Sounds
with that,
good.
we'll go and break for today.
That's good stuff. Thank you so much.